right, hello everyone. Welcome to episode 5 of my podcast DevTalks. In this podcast, we talk about various game topics and dev-related aspects of game development. That I'm gonna lose my train of thought this episode. I guarantee it. Um, I am your host Luna, and I am a game designer and artist. Today we are going to be talking about the art of guiding players. Now, that may sound a little weird to most people, but pretty much what it means is how someone tells, like, how the developers guide the player through a game without literally telling them what they need to do. Now, sometimes it is literally telling the player what they need to do, but it is best to always just avoid that. For many reasons, and one of those main reasons is just players don't like being told what to do in a video game. The point of playing a video game is you have freedom of choice. You have freedom of X, Y, and Z. You get to do what you want to do in the video game as long as the video game allows it. And players don't want to feel like the game can't allow it. So very important stuff. uh Now, let's see. What are the methods? There are actually several, as I mentioned earlier before we fully started the podcast. So if you were here live, you got to hear me ramble a little bit before we started fully. um, and let's see, how many are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 ways that I have written down, and that does not mean that there is only those 7 ways. There's plenty of ways to guide a player, and plenty of ways that can suddenly pop out of someone's brain to be new to the game industry. So let's see. Let's start with mental mapping, facilitating mental mapping. So essentially, mental mapping is when a player plays a game, they typically will create a map within their head of how to navigate through a game. And the thing is, when you want players to be able to create that map means everything. That's how a player feels like they can get around the game without getting lost or confused. I also need to stop saying free. um, Keeping the map space simple is probably one of the core keys to being able to facilitate mental mapping. Making clear spaces that are able and like easily recognizable to that are making clear spaces that are easily recognizable to the player is important. It can be done with just simple shapes, like typically rooms are designated to very basic shapes, whether it is just I think, is that a hexagon or an octagon? That's a very oddly shaped octagon. Octagons, squares / rectangles, circles, which are not common at all, but typically very basic shapes. And that doesn't just go for just one room, but rather the entire building. You don't have random shaped buildings that look like a terrible Pac-Man. Yes, I am describing what is over here right now as a terrible Pac-Man because that's what it looks like to me. um, So creating shapes that are just easily recognizable will allow the player to easily navigate through their environment. Same thing with adding things like symmetry. If one thing looks the same on one side, or it seems similar to what they've already been through, that makes it so much easier for the player to go through. Reducing clutter or using clutter to guide the player. Obviously, a player is not going to try and walk through a mountain of chairs. But you still want them to be able to see past those chairs for the most part, because that may be the direction they are trying to go. So essentially using clutter not just as, oh, we're going to throw random stuff everywhere like it would be in the real world. No, you want the clutter to provide direction without being giant arrows. And another thing is reducing the amount of intersecting connections and amount of turning the player has to do. Now, some of that can be used to the advantage. This is research I did just for general game design, but say you're doing a horror game, the more you turn the player around, the more lost they get. Because if you know that feeling for just spinning over and over, that dizzy feeling, that's what you can recreate with multiple turns. Not always good for every game, but horror games can very much use that. It becomes confusing. The player will get lost in a good way, but at the same time, the interconnections, that's what you want to try to avoid, because you don't want the player to continue to end up in the exact same spot, walking in circles. You don't want the player feeling like they're making no progress. Another thing to do is to try and create a dedicated area that the player will recognize over and over. Typically, this is done with a section that the player will return to after exploring. This is also seen in a lot of games. There's typically some sort of hub or main area that the player will see multiple times as they progress throughout the game. This area is meant to be rememberable and recognizable. That will allow the player to easily navigate to the sections that are meant to go. It can easily be achieved with unique themes, creating connections, defining areas, and revealing complexity slowly as the player makes more progress. Essentially letting the player know some things have been changed. Now, again, I'm going to continue to use horror games as an example. That is the genre I play the most. I know a lot of other games include it, but it is easier for me to pick out a horror game as an example. There is the main room in one of the Amnesia games. I don't remember which one it is. I think it was Dark Descent. Essentially, there is the main lobby of the building that you continue to return back to, and doors will either open or lock behind you. That main area is rememberable because it is a large open space of like a mansion. With fairly easy navigation because things will get blocked off. That might have been Machine for Pigs, but I don't remember exactly. I just know it's one of the older Amnesia games. It's been a few years since I played through those, so remembering exactly, I would have to look that up. But there are plenty of games that do that, where it's just there's one area that you return to that essentially works as a hub or a lobby. Even if it's a single player game, it's an area you always return back to. Yesterday on stream, we were actually playing Monster Hunter. The area to remember is easily the hub in Monster Hunter. You continue to return back to it. Now, one thing I feel like Monster Hunter World specifically, kinda didn't follow this by is that lower area is extremely cluttered. Now, if we're talking about the upper areas where the weaponsmithing is, the board is, the canteen, etc., that, in my opinion, is extremely easy to navigate. You know exactly where the canteen is and all that stuff, but everything that's at that bottom, there's so much going on that yes, it's rememberable, like the area as a whole, but remembering where specific people are, I don't think is as easy. That is my personal thought, though, on that. So, another thing to help with mental mapping for players is creating environments that are allowing for essentially connections that the players can make physically, visually, and mentally. A player physically will achieve things by exploring and visually looking at things that may be appealing to them as they explore. This will cause the players to make mental maps of what that area looks like so they know where they are. Connections can also be specific markings or wow. I am so sorry about losing my train of thought. That has been a thing recently. But essentially providing information with a player. So say in the group you have a symbol that represents, so like we're talking about like single player game, let's say a story-based game. The player finds a group. They know that they're at that group's location when they see a specific symbol. They then know that symbol marks that area. So later on, they may see that symbol again and can visually connect where they are. Now, they can recognize that symbol and also plant essentially a mental marker on that spot. So when they leave, they know where to go back to and how to find it by just using that as a marker. Essentially, it creates, if you were to not have a map in a video game, it creates a mental map upon which those markers act as waypoints. Now, those markers don't actually have to be real symbols. Those can actually just be, there is a tree that looks like this. There is a rock that looks like this. There is a building. There is this NPC. There's a car. There's something that is identifiable. Oh, words are hard. I can already tell this is gonna be an episode where I end it with my mouth just hurting because there is so much to talk about here. Creating a sense of geography, that's also leading into it. That's another thing that is using waypoints, except for instead of, man-made connections that you can provide, that is actual landmarks, maps, and other reference points that the player can create a larger sense in the world. Now, this is an example I have never played. Actually, I can't remember. I think it's the Last of Us game. The example I'm talking about, I have not played the game, but I know it. In the game, there is one building that no matter where in the city you are, pretty much, you can always see that building. That building is a landmark because that is the place you are trying to get to. Let's see if I can actually Last of Us building. Let's see. Do it. Sorry, I still have music playing. Objective. Let's see. And it's honestly just really good. Like part of it is really good camera work, is what it boils down to. Trying to find a good like image. So there is one building I'm commonly seeing in some of these screenshots. So I'm gonna share this screen. So we can take a look at it. So if I zoom in here, if we take a look, there is this tilted two buildings that are going into each other. And no matter where you are, you can often see these buildings, as that is where you are trying to get to in the game. I don't think this one includes it, but this one is a different example because you can see it here and you can see it here. It does it a lot with whatever your objective is. You can pretty much always see it, and that is your goal. If you've played the game, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And that is one of the ways you can guide the player to finding their location. That creates that sense of importantness because why is that camera why is your camera essentially always on that? Well, that's your objective. Get to your objective. And so many times that the NPCs also point out, they go, "Oh, I don't know what the building's called, but oh, I can see the blank from here. I can and then you can actually see it. You know where you're going." There is a video out there. I can't remember what it's called, but it explains specifically that example in really good detail. If I can find it, I'll include it in the link as a link in the YouTube video when this goes live on YouTube, or not live, but when this gets uploaded as a VOD on YouTube. Definitely a very important video. It explains so much, but I am just covering really honestly the gist of it right now. One day we can definitely go more in depth about that specific. We could probably go in depth about all of the examples I have here, and even further in depth than just that. We will be just covering the gist of it for today, and I will definitely return to these when I have good examples of my own. I will just have to do a decent amount of research to actually achieve that. But with placing that building always kind of in view, it made it easier for the player to know exactly where they need to go. The player could see their objective clearly as they slowly progress closer to it. It was always in view, and it was always mentioned, and that guided the player closer. Now, that creates a mental map of where they need to go. Not necessarily how they got there, but it creates a path of that's where I'm going, and that's what players need often. They need to know how to get from what they know where their point is. That's where they're currently at. Where's point B? That is often not told in games. That is something I actually have noticed a lot with games, and games try to use other methods like waypoints and such that are physically placed on the map. Very recently, and tomorrow we'll be actually continuing this game, uh, but Bendy in the Dark Revival. Now, in the first Bendy game, there was no waypoints. They actually did a really good job at guiding the player, to be honest. You kind of had a general idea of where to go. In the Dark Revival, however, they had to make some waypoints because actually I did it myself. There was one point where I was supposed to climb, like I started climbing up the wall. You get scared off the wall, and then I was like, okay, am I just supposed to go the other way? And I turned around and went the other way, even though there was a waypoint. Um, and I'm sure plenty of other people have also done that, and I'm sure it was even more common when there wasn't a waypoint. Um, Now that is a really good game, and I'm not trying to be like, oh, it's bad for that reason. No, it's they chose to do something different with guiding. They didn't choose to just guide through visuals. They chose like literal waypoints, which is a thing. Um, so another thing, uh, now that specifically is just talking about mental mapping. Mental mapping is probably one of the more easier methods to achieve. It is, at least in my opinion, because you are creating the path that you need your player to go down. And sometimes creating that path will be actually difficult, but it's how are you going to inform your player what point B is and how are they going to get there and how are they going to know to get there without you literally telling them, without you literally drawing a line from point A to point B. Um, but we will now move on to the next uh, topic within this, which is influence via composition. Now, that's how it was. That's a phrase that I've heard it by. Um, However, I honestly like to call this part more colors. How colors influence the player. Um, because it covers a lot more of like using different ways of coloring the environment, shading the environment to guide that player to their location. Um, Now, some of the basic concepts is just providing unity and variety to a scene and using contrast and other methods to create a point of interest. Um, was getting asked a rather important question. Uh, and let's actually, can I? Did they get rid of markers on stream? Oh no, there it is. There we go. So when you say you're in a large room, you're in a very large room and everything looks the same. Now we like let's see if I can actually get an example. Um let's just look up like a sci-fi room. Um Let me find a good example that actually has like a decent amount of space. Um, sorry. I mean, I shouldn't say sorry because there's nothing to be sorry about. We're looking for. I'm just looking for something with doors. Um, hallway of doors. Let's just literally look up a hallway full of doors. Okay. Um, we're just gonna uh pull that up there. This is a lovely little stock image. So this is the room you walk into as a player. Now, we're gonna uh just kind of mark this door as like red because that is the door you want to go into. Um Now, why do you want to go into that room? How do you know to even go into that room? Like the red is actually not showing. That is just for us as like this is background knowledge. The As a developer, you know that it is this door that they need to go to. How do you communicate that to the player? Well, I mean, yeah, you could just point it a bunch of arrows at it. But like no one wants that. Yeah, you could write like little information things on each one and like that is one method. That is definitely something that could work. Like a symbol and the player knows what symbol that is. That is something that can definitely work. But that is also not necessarily obvious. A player might not be looking at what these doors say. So what can be done is say there was just a light over every door, just like these ones on the ceiling. Um, we're just doing a little bit of photoshopping now. So we have a light above every door. Um, these are some not great lights, but it's fine. Uh, Not great photoshopping lights, at least. So yeah, we got all our lights. Now let's just say that we're gonna turn off all of these lights that are right above every door except for the one we want the player to go into. So I'm just gonna grab like a we're just gonna use like this dark gray just to signify that the lights are off. The ones that are on are pretty much white light. Now you could do that. Now this is also depending a little bit on what kind of game you're trying to create here. Because this easily could work for any game right here. Very brightly lit room. Arguably even toning down these lights to make this one really like pop over here. So like something that can definitely be done is just going over here and going. There is now just a god beam coming from this light to signify to the player that they need to go to that door. That is the only door with light on it. Now, obviously, this depends on the specific game, because if you're in a horror game and you walk into this bright room, And you just kind of go, yes, go to the god room. Like, the player's gonna, like, playing a horror game is not gonna really trust that. Like, it's not even gonna apply horror at that point. But instead, what easily could be done, instead of that, is uh, changing that light entirely. Like, those other lights can still be off, but making it red or um making like a red glow essentially, or even a blue. Now blue is not necessarily associated with evil, and that's why it's not necessarily the best, but a blue light over that door, that then creates contrast. Every other light in this room is yellow or orange. It's a warm hue. Even if you left all these other lights on, so like, let me just turn all these lights back on. Now, I'm also going to turn this to a shine effect. That door is now blue. That door now stands out. Like, walking into this room now, you're gonna immediately see that door because it is standing out. That is where your focus is going to go. And yes, most players will still go and touch all these doors to make sure they don't open. But they're still going to make their way to this door. And that is the important part. Like, the player knew this was the door to go to. Now, this is a very, very blue light. And most of the time it won't necessarily be this blue. It will still be like a very more like that, and it'll probably actually turn this the rest of this environment a little bit more towards the cooler side of colors in this area, so the player more specifically knows. But that is besides the point. That, like, that's a little bit further than what I can do with just a quick sketch. That is important though. That draws your player in. That is a contrast out of the environment, creating a point of interest. Contrast can be done with colors, it can be done with opposite characteristics. Instead of changing the color of this door, what we could have done is we could just add vines to it. Like, just there's no vines growing out of this doorway. Like, why is there vines? Who knows? But that's now an interesting door. The player is going to just go to that door now, like, no questions asked. That's where they need to go, and they know that's where they need to go. And to go more specifically, if we want to go more in depth about contrast, warm colors, cool colors, that kind of thing, we're now going to get into a little bit of color theory. Warm colors, so your reds, your oranges, your yellows, your pinks, those are considered your warm colors. They're gonna appear closer and pop out more, especially if you put this in a cool environment. So now let's say we just change this entire room to just this cooler environment. We got green doors now. We're gonna now. Let's say we then add just some orange lights coming from the door. Probably even more orange than that. Like that. That's now a point of interest. That's gonna draw you in because that is a war. I mean, right now it's kind of on the green side. So again, not perfect. We're working with stock images right now. But a warm color will definitely it be inviting. The player wants to go there. Again, back to the god rays, the whole association of, in a way, God, like when now this is going to dip a little bit into religious concepts, but that's just because that is something that was ingrained into a lot of the world and is still it's the easiest way to explain something um that most people will understand other than just being like, ah, yes, warm colors draw you in. Well, warm colors are labeled warm colors because they do that. Most people seek warmth of some sort, whether it's literal warmth or just the feeling, like like people describe warm, fuzzy feelings when they're talking about love. Warm vacations is often where people want to go. Yes, there's some people that want to go to cold locations, but most people talk about warmth and wanting to go to that warmth. Those colors are often what we see when we talk about those warmths. The sun creates red, yellow, orange hues. Fires is something we consider a warm object, and that is something that is typically red, orange, and yellow. So those colors just have an association with our brain. If we want to go back to my more religious topic, I know I'm not a religious person. But God rays. That's what they're just referred to in lighting terms. Is when it is a beam of sunlight that it like pretty much guides. It is referred to as God rays because that is what is talked about in a lot of like religious standpoints often. The don't go towards the light. It is a typically talking about a bright, warm light when guiding to the afterlife. Now, depending on the afterlife too, but that's besides the point. It is meant to be inviting. Uh, More saturated colors also draw attention because it pops. Um, and you can actually create non-saturated colors. Like you can cause non-saturated colors to pop. So let's say this was more of a white instead of a orange. Like it's still on the warm hues, but it's more dull of a color. Like if I were to turn this off and turn up the brightness, it's like this salmony, that's not even salmon anymore color. But you understand the point. It now doesn't look like a bright orange light. It now just looks like a light. What you can actually do in return is to also draw people away. A lot of people tend to be scared of the dark. So to kind of prevent the player from going where you don't want, creating darkness. It is human nature to be scared of the dark. A lot of humans tend to be at some point in their life. So just creating a all around darker environment besides that one light then encourages the player to go to that one area. It encourages that area to stand out and draw the person in. Now, that could still work with a very orange light, but now you don't need the light to be bright orange. You can just now have a light. Now, another thing that can be achieved, camera orientations. Camera orientation is a big thing. Now, a lot of players don't like when their camera is taken over. However, you can force the player when they enter a room. Now, I don't know if I'll actually be able to achieve this with this image, but we can definitely try. But pretty much just go, yeah, no, we're not going to achieve it. So let's say this front door. You walk into the room, you're not walking in it from one of these side doors. You're walking and looking straight ahead. Where are you going to go? Straight ahead. That's where most people would go. Now, something you can actually see this in. I have a perfect example of where you see this kind of guidance. It is actually a I'm gonna pull up a clip. This game is 33 years old. Pat the boy. I will pat the boy in just a second. So hello, Game Check. Welcome on in. But we will talk about that game in just a second. And all right, if you have been on this podcast before, I have probably mentioned it, and I will probably continue to mention it. This game shows so much about game design and game development. It is extremely important. Sorry, responding to an important message. But this game is extremely important, and this game is Super Mario World. Now, this game literally starts Mario. We're actually gonna full screen this. Let's just look. Where's Mario starting? Good thing I'm not blocking it. Mario is starting right down there. He is starting on the left side of the screen. That causes the player's instincts to immediately go right. Run to the right of the screen. Why do they do this? Well, because there's nothing left. But that positioning of the camera frame tells the player what they need to do. That offset pretty much goes, there's no reason to go left. Why go left? Go right. It is it is just a and then on top of that, there is something standing in your way on the right. That provides more interest of, hey, maybe I should go check out that thing. Just so much about what is happening right here is telling that player to just go right. And it is really just like, because Mario does, like, there's lighting, obviously, like, there's shading on things, but not like lighting that you see in video games now. Not, at least not in this Mario game. So you can't rely really too much on lights for even just the screen. I mean, yeah, you could probably put a lantern, like, whatever, but that's not important. You could argue that the color of the Koopa is drawing the player that way. The color of the Koopa is red and orange, which is warm, which we said was inviting, which is closer, which wants you to get closer. I mean, obviously, in Super Mario World, Koopas are not actually something you want to go up and hug, but it is still telling the player to go that way. No, if we look at the difference between the red of Mario and the red of the Koopa, that indicates a few different things too. Like, that bright red is a warning. The orange tells you to go near it. So, essentially, that Koopa is saying, come here, but I am an enemy. Versus Mario's red. Mario's red is very dull. It is not telling you to go that direction. Obviously, once you start moving, you realize that that's your player character. So you don't want to try to move towards your own player character because that's impossible. Yeah. And then on top of that, you're starting on the left side of your screen. So you're being told to go right without being told to go right. Anyways, we're going to leave this screen up here for a little bit. Now, another thing that you can do to uh, guide a player is break up the geometry that you do have. We talked about how it's important to have recognizable shapes for the player to follow, but then breaking it up. Now, actually, we're going to switch back to the other screen. We'll probably pull this up later. But let's say we have, just go back to this. We're gonna, that is a circle that I wanted to square. So let's say you have just this square room. Well, and let's make a little blue dot, just to represent the player. You entered to the room over here. The exit, we'll make the exit green, is over here. Now, this is a huge room. And if there's nothing in this room, the player can literally just go from point A to point B without worrying about any of this extra space. However, there is, let's say, a maze. I am not great at creating mazes, so let's hope we actually end up with an endpoint. Because I don't know if we actually will with me creating them. I normally use maze generators, not creating them from scratch. So I'm good at solving maze puzzles, but creating them is a whole different ballgame. I'm just gonna add some more random-ish lines over here. All right, close enough. So yeah, now the player has to get from point A to point B, but there are just a bunch of walls. Well, they're like, yeah, you can do the typical maze method of just stick left and eventually you'll get to the end. But we can't just rely on the player to just do that. Like that's not fun. Um, so instead of creating a maze exactly like this, I'm gonna move these dots to a different layer. Instead, now kind of going back to that chairs idea that I had before, put a stack of chairs kind of at an angle, like right there, and then maybe like there's some tables or something. So the player can still see the exit, but they now have to get to said exit. And instead of having sharp corners, the player now has to navigate through just some clutter, some strategically placed clutter. We'll just put some tables down there. That, yes, changes how exactly the puzzle looks, but player can now easily be guided by these swoops. And arguably, instead of putting a table at the end here, that's this last one, this should probably be something more diagonal, suggesting to go up. Because this, another way to think about it is, okay, this either tells you to go down here, but there's no exit up here, so it's telling you to go this way. And this wall tells you to go that way. Then you hit a point, well, there's a space right here. This tells you to go down, and then this one will bounce you up. Essentially, kind of like a pinball, in a way. And you have now just told the player exactly how to navigate this without putting arrows. By just using some general shapes, some general slanted lines to just suggest to the player to go that way. That's all you've told. That's all you've told the player is, hey, maybe follow this. Now I'm going to switch over to the Mario screen again because that's a little more interesting to have on screen. And that may come back up again, may not. We'll see. And now that actually went on to the next point a little bit, continuity, which is lines and curves and motion to create looking points of where the player is going to look. Lines on a wall, depending on where your camera angle is, will create direction. So Mario does not have a good example of this because Mario is Super Mario World is a 2D game. The only thing you can suggest is that all of these lines, hold on, I am going to correct myself here. I just re-looked at this. So you have your flat lines. Actually, I'm going to take a screenshot of this and we're going to pull it up on the art program so I can draw over this. Because I think that'll be easier to explain. What exactly I'm seeing right now. So I'll just use like a bright red. So you have your base plane, which is just it's ground. It's flat ground. But all these rocks in the background are slanted to the right. Again, signaling the player to go right. Even this bush right here, all of the hedge is pointing right. Right now, realistically, the only thing not suggesting to go right is this Koopa, which is facing left. But everything tells the player to go right. Even the M to the right R just naturally goes to the right. The W at the end here is to the right. The L goes to the right. The E up here. So many, this O even. If you look at the pixels, everything suggests to go right. Through lines. Mario is such a good game for this. Oh my god. Like, sometimes you don't even think about it. Now, it's been pointed out to me many of times that this one scene in Mario is literally telling you to go right. The more you look at it, the more you realize how much and how many different ways it's telling you to go right. It's such a good game. It's such a well-made game. Now, I can't guarantee we'll actually get through this entire list because we're only on 2 so far. And we're already like an hour in, so I don't think we'll necessarily get through this entire list. But there is also another way to do this, and it kind of leads back to the cluster I was talking about with, like, you could use chairs and stuff. Destroying certain things. This is labeled as evolving composition. So essentially, a player is not progressing forward. Now, I can't remember what game we had talked about when I was doing this paper, but there is a game upon which if you stand behind cover, it gets destroyed after so much time, pretty much forcing you to move forward. You don't have another option. Changing the lighting. This is a commonly seen thing in a lot of media. Now, let's say all the lights are normal. Like, everything is normal. And then all of a sudden, everything goes dark, and then there's just some red flashing lights. That completely changes the lighting. Adding and removing hazards, enemies, so on and so forth. That also will force the player to do something. That is seen actually in one of the Outlast games. Now, I still would love to cover some of these more in further depth with better examples, but right now we'll just do some basic examples. In one of the Outlast games, you are running down the corridors. You go to turn to go out a door, but then there's enemies standing outside that door trying to get to you, so that forces you to keep running down the corridors instead of going out that door. That changes your direction. That influences the player where they're gonna go. There are other games that also do this. Some a little more subtly than others, and some are kind of hard to exactly suggest. But Removing or adding a hazard. Overwatch. Overwatch on Eichenwald. Specifically on, I'm pretty sure it's Eichenwald that I'm thinking of. Hold on. Let me double check that map's name. Um okay, yeah. Eichenwald. I just had to make sure. Your cart is a battering ram, and then you get to the castle doors, upon which you bashed, like, your battering ram bashes down the door. But once it bashes down the door, rocks fall, making it very difficult to jump over that area, forcing the players to have to go around, which changes how the players play. Because now their cart is on the other side of this wall that they can't get around. Um, that is something that changes and creates a different effect for players. Um, it offsets that set of players too. It makes it harder for them to get to the cart and gives defense a little bit more of a fair time. Um, it is something that is extremely interesting that I really honestly just thought about. Uh, it is influencing the player and changing the environment for the player. Um, all right, now we will move on to the third topic. Now there are 7 of these, and like I said, based on how this is going, we probably won't get through all of the art of guiding players today. So this will definitely be part 1 of the art of guiding players, and next month we will probably continue it, is what I'm thinking. Lure with affordance. Now, um, affordance is the quality of an object that defines its possible use or makes it clear out and how it should be used to the player. Um, that's essentially, it's something that draws the player to do something. Um, essentially, a player. Well, let's think about this. A player sees a gun on the ground. The only thing you can really do with that gun is pick it up and shoot it. That's just a small example, and that's like very, very basic. That's not entirely what this topic is about, but because you still have to lure the player to pick up that gun. But the player sees the gun, they know what to do with it. Um, and part of luring with affordance is perceiving the affordance. That's what I was just saying. A common object that a player sees every day in their normal life, uh, or have in their normal life, that just makes sense with their intended purpose. Um, if something is to have a handle, now we're talking about, like, obviously doors, a handle, and also depending on the handle, suggests different things. Now, actually, let's actually look up handles. Um, I didn't want to click on shopping. I wanted to click on that. So here we go. We got a few different types of knobs and handles. Now, if we look at, actually open this in a different tab. So these top ones that have kind of like the underneath, that suggests to pull. That does not suggest to push. That is just a natural thing. The same thing with this more long thin one. It suggests it is a pull. In some cases, this long, thin one can suggest a push too, depending on the object, but we're talking about drawers or doors or anything like that. That's what I suggest, is a pull. Now, most of the time, with knobs, you turn and you push. Now, there are some handles now that we can look at, like these, that can mean either. But most of the time, you are not going to push this door to open it. Unless you're pushing to the side. You're not going to push forward to open this door. And obviously some of these ones can also indicate the opposite. But if we think about on a car, you would pull open this door handle. You would not push open that door handle. Now that seems like a no-brainer, and that's the point. It's an everyday object that people just know what to do with it. And that's the idea. You want to create those objects that players just know what they need to do. They just know. And that's important. Now, latches. Latches really draw players in. That is something that players know, like, that latch means it's got to be opened. Now, you can see this on, like, boxes, and sometimes it's not necessarily that important, but if it has a latch that is not locked, a player is going to try and open it. That's just kind of how it is. It is a symbol that players just want to affect. Another example is wooden boxes. If you have a flamethrower, it should be flammable. It just should be flammable. I don't think there's any universe where someone would look at a box and be like, nope, it's fine. It doesn't need to catch on fire. In what universe? And that's another thing. Most doors should be openable. Now, in games, games really love to put in doors that you cannot change. I don't know why. They really like to do that. And I mean, I should know why. It's partly because aesthetic reasons. You're not going to walk down a long corridor that's just only got one door most of the time. But obviously the player, like, you don't want the player going into every room. But then that door should at least be interactable, not necessarily openable. So it's just doing things that the player expects out of other things. If there is a TV and there is a remote on the couch, the player's going to want to interact with that remote and turn on that TV. Even if the TV is literally just static. That will satisfy the player. Now, the other thing is, say you have a hallway full of doors, but the last one is open. The player is going to know that open door is something they should definitely walk up to. All other doors are closed. There is no access, there is no invite to those closed doors. Essentially, you at that point, you're inviting the player to take a path, and that will guide the player to their next destination. Now, sometimes, especially in horror games, they will slam that exit shut in your face. But that is for a different effect. That is specifically something about horror games. They still invited you to walk up to that space, though. They still were wanting you to go that direction. They just wanted to scare you afterwards. That's just how horror be. Like, um, now, another thing is it's referred to as lowering mechanics. Now, it's placing certain things down in strategically to encourage players to be drawn to them. Like placing a healing station after a boss fight. That will encourage the player to. They just got into a huge fight. They're now low on health. They should heal. Same thing with saving stations. Placing a way to save after a fight, after something big, or even right before, that leads players. Now, you also want to place these things in the direction you want your player to eventually go. Now, what do I mean by that? So, Bioshock. Bioshock is just I'm using that as an example more because it has a wide open space. So say you get into a boss fight, you exit the tunnel, and as soon as you exit that tunnel, down the hall, like you enter this huge area that has the stairs that go up and uh some walls like in the center. You could like I'm not describing perfectly exactly what Bioshock looks like, but can kind of get the idea. And down the way you see um I actually don't know what they're called, but the little sister upgrade machines. And that is also going the direction you are meant to go. Of course, you're going to go to it. You're going to go to it even if you don't look at that little objective arrow that's in front of you. Now, I'm going with Bioshock 1 because it's the one I've played. So I know that there's a little arrow that tells you which direction you should be going if you have an objective. So let's say that a little objective arrow does not exist. You see that machine, you're going to be drawn to that machine. The player is going to go to that machine because that is a potential upgrade. If they have the resources for it. If not, they're still probably going to walk towards it because that's roughly what exists there. Typically, also when you walk out of that realm is the save spot, or at least the respawn of the automatic save. That's typically what they put at the end of bosses, at the very least. And it like that. There is also a reason why like there is often in games where you will reach a healing station and then the next door is just the end of the level. And that is because you like it rewarded you for defeating the boss and gave you an option to heal. But that healing station now has also been like, okay, this healing station is literally right next to the door you're going to go through. Now, sometimes it feels like, oh, you just wasted healing, but it brought you to that door instead of having you backtrack. Now, when things like healing stations are not placed at the uh, exit point after a boss fight, the player will just run back to the last healing station that they knew about. I know I have done this. I've seen other people do this where they can fought a boss, they're extremely low on health. Let me run all the way back to the last save point. I've done this with Undertale a few times. Where I ran back to the last saved, and then I went into the next room after the fight, and there was a save. So instead of putting the save before the door, they put it after, and that made it a little more confusing. It did not help, like, create a sense of security. That's another thing with healing stations and guiding the player that way. Security. You want the player to feel like they're doing the right thing, like they're safe to do that thing. But sometimes It's just the opposite effect is created. Uh, Now, attention with characters. Now, this is typically NPCs. Sometimes it can be other stuff. Um, but essentially, narratively or visually, a character will tell um, the player what something can be used for, where to go, what the player should be doing. Now, um, that is a not a favorite of a lot of people, and most of the time is tuned out. Again, going back to the fact I was playing Monster Hunter yesterday, a lot of stuff I just kind of skipped over because not interesting. Like, I mean, it's a good game, but the information being provided was not interesting. But what they did do in Monster Hunter, all of the information you don't really know does not have a voiceover. But all of the extremely important information of like what your next objective is, there is voices. There are voice lines for those things. It's not just text on the screen, it's an actual voice telling the player, hey, we're gonna do this. You should do this. This. That kind of deal. Um, that guides the player to feeling like, yeah, I should do that. That's what seems right in the world. That makes sense. Yeah, that's what I should be doing right now. Um, that can be also created many of different ways. It could be, hey, we should do this right now. It's very important. We'll give a reward. It could be, oh my god, we need to do this right now. It's so urgent. It's different depending on what kind of game you're going for, what the objective is, how important essentially it makes the player feel. And it's essentially just got to make sense to the player. That's the next step. That's what they should be doing. That makes sense. And that was a lot for right now, to be honest. Um that is only 3 of the different ways to guide a player in a game. That was a ton of talking for me. um there is still so much information. That's just scratching the surface of those topics too. Like, I could go into so much more detail with more specific like games, um, and all that. But that is just the surface. Um, and we will definitely return to this topic several times over. We still have 4 more of these to cover. Um, I need to actually mark that on my paper to start there. Um, just so I know where I am starting. Um, but that was a lot to talk about. And I wish I could continue to go into more detail on. Maybe we will also revisit some of these, especially once we start getting references with other people. I can go, okay, I want you to talk about X in games. I want you to talk about the mental mapping that this game provided, and hopefully get some interest of some friends on what exactly they are looking for, like that want to participate in this. Um, I will really want to get some more people talking on this podcast. We have not had a guest in a little while. Uh, so I want to try and reach out and see if I can get some dev friends to join me on here soon just to talk about something. I really want to do an idea of like one day we do like a build game, like we build a game in the amount of time or something, like not like, but just like the concept of a game kind of deal. I feel like that would be a really cool idea. Maybe when if there's a game jam that comes up, we can do that. But uh, and I can just show all of that. But anyways, that is all for this episode of the podcast. This is the episode 5 of DevTalks, and we talked about how to guide a player through a game. Uh, I appreciate everyone who comes by and supports this podcast. I do really, really appreciate it, and I hope you all enjoyed listening to me ramble about random dev things. And hopefully, it gives you a better insight next time you play a game. It definitely gives me more insight, and honestly, listening to stuff like this, that's what made me interested in making games. So, um, maybe you guys can just see something different the world, about the worlds of game design and game development, and just appreciate it just a little bit more. Um, but, anyways, I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day, night, whatever time it is. That is the end of this episode, and for now, bye.